When we hear energy shortfall, what would that look like in the real world?
Well, if you have extreme temperatures and there's a demand on natural gas, there's also demand on more electricity. And what's happening in this country is our demand keeps growing up, but our supply hasn't been keeping up. And so every year when this North America Reliability Corporation issues their seasonal risk assessments, there's this trend over the last 4 or 5 years where the margins are getting thinner and thinner. And so what we have a situation where you're going to have to, if there's not enough supply to meet the demand, utilities have to start shutting people off. So it's rolling blackouts. We don't want that to happen, but that's the risk we face this winter.
How can we be falling short, though, when I looked up the data, the hard data? The U.S. is producing the most oil and gas in history.
Well, the answer is that we are making more power plants. That's really the problem, is that, in fact, we've been shutting down a number of our power plants that still have useful life left. And look, we're building a lot of renewable energy, which has its role. But, you know, the wind doesn't blow 24 hours a day and the sun doesn't shine. Particularly in the winter, the wind isn't blowing as much. So that's where we're at risk. We're reducing our always available capacity, which is either natural gas or coal or nuclear, and we're replacing it with what we call intermediate capacity that's not always around. Our demand's growing, our supply's changing to less reliable supply. That's a recipe for blackouts.
If I'm reading this report correctly, Mr. Matheson, 20% of generating capacity could go offline during a freeze, let's say. Whose responsibility is it? Because private utility companies made billions and billions in profit last year, according to accountable.us, when they dug into their financials. Should the companies be the ones investing more and, amping this up?
Well, I can't speak for the for-profit ones because I represent rural electric co-ops that are not-for-profit, but I can say this. There's a desire on industry to invest in more infrastructure. It's really hard to get anything new built in this country. It's hard to get a permit to build a solar plant, a wind farm, let alone a natural gas plant or more electric transmission lines. So there's a public policy component to this that's really a challenge. There's a desire to make these investments, but it's hard to make these things happen quickly. And yet our demand for electricity keeps growing in this country. I'll tell you what, these data centers that pop up everywhere for cloud computing, we're using computer capacity more and more, and that uses more and more electricity. AI is going to up that demand even more. So it's good news the economy's growing, right? But the bad news is it's hard to create additional electric generation capacity to meet that demand. And so when you get an extreme weather event, that's where we have this possibility of blackouts.
I mean, in Texas, whenever it's really hot or really cold, they pay those companies to not be Bitcoining and whatever it is because they say, we got to keep this going. So if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying it's not necessarily private companies who can just do this on their own, that they're giving dividends to their investors instead of, investing in infrastructure. You're saying, customers, we're stuck with the rolling blackout. So what would the government do? Are you saying it's the EPA's problem? Whose problem is it?
Well, that's a good question. Who's responsible for reliability? But there are policies, both at the federal and state level, that, number one, are encouraging us to shut down power plants before the end of their useful life. EPA is one of the prime examples of that. And quite frankly, they're proposing new rules that are going to make this problem worse. We're trying to get in front of that. We're trying to sound the alarm about these new proposed rules that will shut down more of our natural gas power plants, for example. This is something where it's the old cliche, when you find yourself in a hole, the first step, stop digging deeper. And the EPA would be a good place to start with that conversation.
These conversations are always so hard for most of us. We're not experts. I mean, you're in this industry, but a lot of us are thinking, I don't know whose fault it is, but I know I need power, especially when it's cold. How can everyday customers prepare? Because I also looked up numbers for this. Cold every year kills 10 times more people than hot weather in our country.
Yeah, it's real serious. You mentioned the outage in Texas 2 winters ago. You had over a couple hundred people die during that incident. This is really, really serious. Just last winter, we had rolling blackouts in 9 states in the mid-Atlantic area during a cold snap. So this is not theoretical. This has happened, and it's not like it's going to happen everywhere for long amounts of time, but the risk is growing every winter. So, again, we're sounding the alarm to try to get in front of this before it gets worse. And we have to have a collective effort to allow more infrastructure to be built, more power plants, more transmission lines. That's going to help us have better reliability and avoid these, what could be horrific circumstances in extreme cold.